Hello and welcome back to the Surfer's Library, proudly presented by Hillsborough Surf Club. I'm Billy Jack, your guide through the pages of surf history, culture, and legends. Today I'll be reading from the book The Big Drop, Classic Big Wave Surfing Stories, edited by John Long. This story is called In the Beginning by Ricky Grigg. In the early 1950s, I was in my middle teens in California and just beginning to tempt big waves along the West Coast. Every winter, we typically had waves 10 to 12 feet. Then one incredible day on January 10, 1953, the surf went ballistic. Rincon, a favorite surfing spot near Santa Barbara, was 15 to 18 feet, and overhead Ventura was even bigger. When I woke up that morning and looked out our second-story beach house window in Santa Monica, giant waves were rolling in half a mile offshore. The surf was breaking beyond the Santa Monica Pier by the breakwater, where it was about 15 feet deep. The waves must have been at least 20 feet high, surf twice as big as I had ever seen. Before I got out of the shower, the phone was ringing off the hook. Charlie Ramers, Peter Cole, Buzzy Trent, Joe Quigg, Matt Kevlin, everyone was headed north for Santa Barbara to surf overhead and Rincon. That day at Rincon, I caught my first triple overhead wave. I got pounded, squashed, rolled underwater, and terrified. By day's end, I felt like a drowned rat. Despite the wipeouts, from then on I was absolutely hooked on becoming a big wave rider. Nothing I had ever experienced felt so dramatic. The huge waves were as magnetic to me as they were beautiful, and I was drawn to them like an enchantment. The waves were huge and I was scared, but sliding down those great silver faces at Rincon was pure joy. It was a fleeting emotion, and like an addiction, it would remain something I would have to recapture again and again, never getting quite enough. That day changed me forever. Big waves were in my blood. The early pioneers of big wave riding in Hawaii felt the same way about giant surf. They were addicts. In the early 1950s, a small cult of Californians lived in a Quonset hut at Makaha Beach on the northwest coast of Oahu. Their names are legendary: Buzzy Trent, Jim Fisher, Walter Flippy Hoffman, and Woody Brown, along with George Downey, Wally Froiseth, and a few other locals who grew up in Honolulu. Jim Fisher was a daredevil who gained fame for riding giant combers and surviving horrible wipeouts. Buzzy Trent and George Downing, though, were the first to successfully tackle the really big waves, those in the 25 feet plus range. They were the first masters of Makaha, the original Top Guns. While in one sense they were rivals and occasionally clashed in the water, they were also the best of friends, motivating and inspiring each other. Bud Brown has some footage of Buzzy Trent in 1953, sliding so fast on what appears to be a 25-foot Makaha wave that his board left the water several times before he finally got the axe. Trent was known for his power and high trim. He would never back down if properly lined up for the takeoff. Buzzy Trent was 8 years my senior as I was growing up in Santa Monica. In high school, he was an all-state fullback. In track, he ran the 100-yard dash in 10.1 seconds. Buzzy began surfing in the mid-1940s when he was in his teens. His board was a 10-6 double-fin, square-tail concave, a Bob Simmons masterpiece of styrofoam sandwiched between plywood. The nose consisted of a huge spoon so pronounced that you could have mixed a salad on it. It was on this board that I caught my first wave. After high school, Buzzy went to USC on a full football scholarship. In his first year, he got clipped and broke both legs. USC withdrew his scholarship, and the next thing Buzzy knew, he was out of college. He became a boxer in the Golden Gloves tournament, but again he met disaster. This time it was the other guy. He hit an opponent so hard it killed him right there in the ring. Next, Buzzy became a bullfighter in Tijuana, then a lifeguard in Santa Monica, and finally, the master gladiator in big surf at Makaha. Actually, with Buzzy you can't say finally. After pioneering big wave riding, he then became a hang gliding fanatic. He once jumped off the mountains above Makaha during a Kona storm and was blown so high he almost froze to death before floating back to Earth in Wahiawa, nearly 25 miles away. Buzzy ended his hang gliding career by hitting a water tank going 50 miles an hour. He lost his kneecap on that one. Next, he took up cycling, but no sooner had he begun that than he had a serious head-on with a parked car. Later, he was playing with his pit bull when it suddenly, for no apparent reason, bit him in the mouth and jaw and wouldn't let go. Buzzy had to strangle the dog to get it to release him. In 1998, at age 69, Buzzy was walking 20 miles a day, every day. You could see him on any day of the week, with hat and shades, head down, walking straight ahead along Kalaniana-Ole Highway, perhaps still dreaming of 25-foot waves of Makaha. While Trent was powered, daring, and athletic grit, Downing was smooth and stylish. He had impeccable judgment and seemed always to be in the right spot. In the 50s, George was known as the Desert Fox, named by Buzzy after Rommel, the famous German general in World War II in the North Africa Theater of Operations. Intense, intelligent, and proud, George has the best wave judgment of any surfer I've ever known. No matter what the topic, if it's on the ocean, sharks, pollution, currents, sand erosion, you name it, George has an expert opinion. At Point Surf, Makaha, there is no one I'd rather surf with. Downing and Trent were not only the first true matadors of big surf, they perfected the equipment and the technique for big wave riding. With help from Joe Quigg, they invented the first elephant gun surfboard, a stiletto teardrop machine shaped like a spear, which would hold on giant watery faces up to 30 feet high. Downing invented a bailout off the back of his board, a rapid sinking maneuver that helped avoid the horrendous wipeout of not making 25 to 30-foot waves. Trent exhibited the willpower, stamina, and boldness to take the wipeouts head-on. On land, he could hold his breath for minutes at a time. In big surf, he could survive 2-wave hold-downs. By the time I reached Hawaii in 1958, Downing and Trent had set the stage for us to tackle even bigger surf on the north shore of Oahu. We simply followed their lead. North Shore surf had been ridden occasionally in the 1940s and early 1950s, but never on a consistent basis and virtually never when it was truly big. An exception was a December day in 1943 when Woody Brown and Dickie Cross went out at Sunset Beach. For several hours, the surf continued to build, and in the late afternoon, it broke loose with waves upwards of 40 feet high. The ensuing epic cost Dickie Cross his life and postponed a full-scale assault of surfing on the North Shore until the late 1950s. By the winter of 1957, a small group of Californians, including Greg Knoll, Pat Curran, Bing Copeland, Del Cannon, Mike Stang, and Mickey Minoz, had migrated to the North Shore. Makaha was getting crowded, and they figured with caution and training they could handle North Shore waves. A small clan of Hawaiians led by Henry Priest had set up a grass shack on the beach at Haleiwa and were regularly surfing there. Surfing the North Shore was an idea whose time had come. One day, the California crew was watching Waimea Bay. It was just starting to break at 10 to 12 feet. Greg Knoll was convinced it could be ridden, and before long, he was leading the pack paddling out. When they got to the lineup, though, there was more talk than action. Everyone agreed it was much bigger than it had looked from the beach, maybe 15 feet or even bigger. There were lots of wipeouts that day. No one was riding a board designed for high speed. None of the boards had cords. No one knew anything about the currents, the bottom depths, or whether the surf was coming up or going down. A few great waves were ridden that day, one in particular by Mickey Minoz. He was about 18 feet, and Mickey, who had been one of the shortest guys in high school, was suddenly 9 feet tall. That day, Mickey made varsity. The following year, 1958, the campaign to conquer the North Shore began in earnest. As luck would have it, it was my first year in the islands. I had graduated from college and was on my surfing sabbatical. I was ready to ride anything, well, almost anything. My first day out was with Peter Cole, who had also just arrived from California. The rain and cold of Northern California had gotten the best of him, and like me, the stories of big surf in Hawaii had fired his imagination. On the first day, Peter and I were out at Sunset, where it was 6 to 8 feet and about as big as I could handle. Late in the day, a few 10 to 12-foot, eye-popping sets came in. Later that winter, Peter and I would surf 12 to 15-foot waves with impunity, putting in 6 to 8 hour days in the water. Peter once made 19 swims for his board in one day, and I was right behind him with 17. By the end of the year, we were in top shape. About 24 of us were surfing Big North Shore on a regular basis that year. The most respected were Greg Knoll, Pat Curran, Peter Cole, Kimo Hollinger, Henry Priest, Buzzy Trent, Jose Angel, Paul Gebauer, Joey Cabell, and George Downing, to name a few. We decided Waimea could be ridden up to 30 feet. Bigger than that, the bay starts to close out. The rip currents turn into rivers too strong to swim against. The only way to get to shore during closeout conditions is to swim in hugging the right side of the bay. Buzzy Trent used to say, "Stay in the whitewater, it's your lifeline to shore." If you drifted left towards the middle of the bay, a rip current tearing out to sea would greet you. In minutes, it would transport you back outside the lineup on the far west corner of the bay. The only way to get in was another round trip, but this time hugging the whitewater. Peter Cole was one of the few guys with enough guts to try catching waves over 30 feet, although he always maintained it was extremely difficult to paddle into waves that big. Waves travel at a speed proportionate to the depth of the water where they break. Thus, a 30-foot wave breaking at a depth of 30 feet is traveling more than 20 miles an hour. To paddle into a wave moving this fast is very difficult, but Peter has ridden a few. Back in the late 1950s, when Peter was in his prime, he took off on 25-foot waves without even thinking about it. This was before leashes, and Peter still refuses to wear one. It was also before he lost sight in one eye after his board skegged him one day at Sunset Beach. But even this couldn't diminish the big wave appetite of Peter Cole, the most stoked surfer I've ever known. At 69, he's still in the lineup at Sunset Beach. If there is surf, no matter what the conditions, he will be there. I can remember dozens and dozens of times when the wind was howling sideshore or even onshore and no one was out at sunset, and Peter would say, "That can be surfed." Sure enough, out he'd go. Of course, this attitude was in part owing to Peter having been an all-American collegiate swimmer who only missed making the U.S. Olympic team by a fraction of a second. Peter could survive any wipeout, any hold down, any swim. Given the 40 years that he's put into the lineup at Waimea Bay, he must have ridden more big ones than anyone else, including all the modern guys. Today, when Peter paddles out at Sunset Beach, everyone cheers. He truly is the oldest and grandest man on the North Shore. In the old days, Peter's strategy was always to catch the biggest wave, and when it came, it was usually him or Pat Curran who caught it. Pat Curran was always a man of few words. His motto was not to talk about it, but just to do it. And what he did was ride the biggest waves. He experimented with boards, perfecting Downing's guns and his own for the bigger, bumpier faces of Waimea Bay and Sunset Beach. Many of us in the original crew used his boards. Board builder Dick Brewer picked up where Pat Curran left off. Pat was a leader in other ways, too. He always sat at the head of the Viking table when dinner was served in his Quonset hut at Makaha. He pounded on the table and uttered monosyllabic cries, "Food, beer, women!" But alas, there were no women. Several seasons came and went, and one day Pat did find a woman. Her name was Janine. Petite, quiet, and lovely, she seemed to exert a magical control over Pat. They were married and had a son, Tom. 25 years later, Tom was the best surfer in the world. Greg Knoll is another guy who tested the limits of riding the big waves from paddling takeoff. One of the great legends of big wave surfing concerns a wave Greg rode at Makaha on December 4th, 1969. That day brought the biggest surf in the history of surfing in the Pacific Ocean. Waimea Bay was reported to be 40 feet, Makaha was 35 feet, and Cana Point was 50 feet. The storm that produced this swell had a wind fetch of 1,800 miles. The winds in the fetch were 65 knots, and it sat stationary in the North Pacific 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii for 48 hours. Property damage caused by high waves to homes on the North Shore exceeded $1.5 million. Only a couple of people went surfing in Hawaii during the peak of the swell. Greg Knoll tells me his giant wave at Makaha was the telling moment in his big wave riding career. It was perhaps 35 feet high, a quantum leap bigger than anything he had ever laid eyes on. In his mind, he knew this was it, now or never. 30 years of training had gone into the buildup for this moment, and he said to himself, now. And what he did made history, the biggest wave ever ridden up to that time. We called Grigg the Bull, and no one has ever been more appropriately named. The name came from Grigg's stance on his board. He was like a Sherman tank. Once he was on his feet, there was no moving him. The bull could plow through tons of whitewater without so much as a wobble. Knocking him off was like overturning a rhino. But it had not always been like that. Grigg and I grew up together in Los Angeles Bay, Grigg in Manhattan Beach, and me in Santa Monica. Grigg was tall and skinny and had arms as long as a chimpanzee. In paddling races, he was tough to beat, pumping up and down from a kneeling position on the board. He was like an oil well, never tiring, as relentless as he was confident. Grigg was a super hot dog surfer. His back turn was snappy, he hung 10, and he was the man on wheels before Dewey Weber. But then Grigg began to grow, and he became heavier and thicker and stronger. During his years pioneering the North Shore, he was a force to be reckoned with. We all respected his power. Knowing he was in the water somehow helped us overcome our own fear. Though Grigg kept surfing for many years after the epic '69 wave at Makaha, that moment was his ascent to the mountaintop, his moment in time. The beast within him had been conquered. The 1960s were the years when the North Shore surf pioneers completed their study. Jose Angel, who had absolutely no fear of gigantic surf, became the first surfer to ride giant backdoor at Pipeline. Jose lived on the beach at Pipeline, and when the surf came up, it seemed to energize him, pulsing through his veins. At night, when he was sleeping, the pounding roar of wild waves seemed like an electric current charging his batteries, and when he woke up in the morning, there was no stopping him. And not just at Pipeline. Jose would paddle out at Waimea and take off on anything. Left of the peak, sometimes too soon, sometimes too late, but always in the supercritical position. He seemed to revel in surviving the most horrible wipeout possible. Jose even trained for a time to challenge 40-foot waves at Cana Point. I called him Iron Man. When I surfed with Jose, I never worried about drowning because I figured he would somehow be there to save me. Over the years, we rode hundreds of days together at the bay and at sunset. Tragically, Jose, one of the greatest watermen of all time, died in a scuba diving accident in 1976. I've never gotten over my despair about losing him, but I know he is at peace. Memories of Jose still inspire us all. Outer Reef Pipeline was one of the last places to be conquered. Most memorable was Greg Knoll's famous ride, filmed in slow motion by pioneer surf photographer Bud Brown. Greg kept going and going and going, and the wave kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Finally, it catapulted him off the nose as his board reached a point where it couldn't go fast enough to keep up with the wave. The next generation. As the 1960s gave way to the 70s, a new era of big wave riding emerged. The pioneering years, when the challenge was simply survival, gave way to a more stylish big wave surfing. New moves such as radical bottom turns, clean S-turns, and some serious tube riding previously accomplished in only surf up to 12 feet began to show up in 20-footers. This increase in maneuverability was made possible by breakthroughs in board construction and design, particularly with the advent of lighter boards. The invention of the thruster with 3 fins gave surfers an enormous increase in maneuverability. The equipment was honed by such master shapers as Greg Knoll, Dick Brewer, Randy Rarick, and Pat Rawson. This second era of big wave surfing lasted through the 1980s. The surfers who impressed me the most were Jeff Hackman, Jock Sutherland, Eddie and Clyde Akau, Nat Young, Mark Richards, Ian Carnes, Mike Doyle, Barry Kanayapuni, Jerry Lopez, Reno Abuera, and Sean Thompson. They were more athletic than their big wave forebears, representing the elite of tens of thousands compared to the several hundred contenders in the pioneering era. Waimea Bay remained the capital of big wave riding, with Makaha taking over top billing only once or twice a decade when Waimea Bay was totally closed out and unrideable at 30 feet plus. The 1990s ushered in a third era of big wave riding, with major new technology, jet skis, restyled guns, foot straps, and the exploitation of the outer reefs such as Jaws on Maui. The third era also includes an ongoing search around the world to discover and conquer the ultimate rideable wave, what Mark Fu called Discovery of Destination X. While big wave riding today has become high-tech, the hearts of the players remain the same. Having lived in Hawaii during most of the early years of big wave surfing, I recognize a few men as outstanding among the best of the first. All possess distinctly different talents, but what they share in common is rugged individualism. Looking back, I see them as completely comfortable with themselves. To a man, they did things their way. Strong, sometimes stubborn, unique, unconcerned with group values, often alone but never lonely. These were men you respected for their power. Most were all-around watermen, swimmers, divers, paddlers, and sailors. They rode huge waves because they were drawn to them naturally, and like my own obsession with surfing, they did it for love. The names and faces of the day's greatest big wave riders have changed many times, but one aspect has not changed and never will: the fear element. No invention, no high technology, no future trick will ever take the place of guts. Buzzy Trent said it best while talking about Waimea Bay in an interview for Surfer magazine in 1966. As Buzzy said, you either have it or you don't. Amen. Well, thank you for listening along. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Until next time, keep your stoke high and your bottom turns tight, and I'll see you in the lineup.